Welcome to the third of our webinars on guided reading. I'm Debra Crouch, and so I'm going to be talking with you today about looking at supports and challenges in text and thinking about how we use that information to help us match books to readers. Today, if you have any questions, one of the things we'd appreciate is if you would send your questions through the chat box and send them as you have them, and then I will address them at the end. I think last time we ended up clicking off just as someone's question came through, so just making sure that you send any questions that you have, and then we'll talk about those at the end. So let's get started. Let me share my screen with you, and off we go. All right, so this will go down here in a second. And we'll get our screen up and going. Here we go. All right. So today's session, as I said, is about thinking about text. And so what we're going to be focusing on is really looking at support text, and we will look at that K through 5. This will be the last of the sessions that is K-5. Be sure that you have the reading development chart. If you haven't printed that out, if you can do that now, because we will be using that to think about looking at the reading behaviors that level text is supporting to develop. This is the last of the K-5 of the webinar series, and our next sessions will start looking at reading stages and grade-specific work around guided reading. So today we are going to think about learning about supports and challenges in text, and our agenda for today is going to address these three questions. We'll be thinking about what are supports and challenges, what do we mean when we talk about that. We'll think about leveled text and what that actually means, and thinking about how we use the information about levels that we know to match books to readers to support guided reading. So as we get going, let's think about, again, we talked at the beginning about this visual about conditions of learning, the various literacy approaches, and thinking about looking at the teacher, the learner, and the text. Today's session is going to focus on text and thinking about what do we look for and think about when we are using text with kids, because all the thinking and talking that they do around those texts is really critical for the meanings, understandings, and learning to be occurring. So one last reminder is just this definition of guided reading that we talked about in the last two sessions. One is that guided reading is students reading, thinking, and talking their way purposefully through a text. And then, as David Hornsby reminded us, applying strategies that they already know in an unfamiliar text, independently with success. So holding that in our thinking as we talk about choosing texts that will support kids as they're doing this kind of work. So what are supports and challenges in text? Well, one of the things that's a phrasing that has become part of the use since of our language, if you will, since Common Core's come out, is this idea about text complexity. And text complexity is not just about something that we think about for kids, because text complexity is something that we all rely on. So one of the things that I enjoy when I have time is cooking. And I think it's one of the easiest places to see what we mean by text complexity. So Betty Crocker's cookbook is the very first cookbook that I ever received. I think I was graduating from college, and this was one of the gifts that I got. So Betty Crocker's cookbook. And one of the things that's so important is that this cookbook is designed for someone who was like me at the time, who was just learning how to take care of cooking for themselves. So one of the things that this cookbook does is it gives you lots of background information on things like different kinds of cheese. It gives it to me not only in a list form to help me know about the name of those cheeses and what their uses are, but also gives me lots of photographs. So there are lots of kinds of supports in this book that help me as someone who's just learning about this topic to be able to access the information. When you look at the recipes that are there, one of the things that I notice a lot in this book is that it's going to have just a few ingredients, and they're typically ingredients that you're going to have on hand or that are very well known ingredients. The other thing they have are really just a few steps I was skimming back through this morning as I was just thinking about this book and in this webinar, and I didn't see any recipes that had more than 6 steps for the direction part of the recipe. The other thing I really appreciate is that many of these many of these recipes also give me photographs to support me in thinking about what that dish should look like as it is completed. And here, this whole notion about how to scramble eggs, which seems really basic now when I think about it, but it's only because I've been cooking for a number of years. So this is the kind of text that would be on the very supported kind of text continuum. Another book that I have in my collection is one that I got just a few years ago, and it's a book called Vegetables, and it comes from Alice Waters. And Alice Waters, if you don't know her, she is a chef and a food activist, among other things. And Chez Panisse is the restaurant that she has in Berkeley, California. Now, Alice Waters is one of the pioneers in the slow food movement. So she's very interested in seasonal food, sustainable food production, and is a pioneer in the farm-to-table movement. And so this cookbook is organized very differently, and it looks very different than the Betty Crocker cookbook, because this is designed for people who typically are people who are very interested in food and food production. And one of the things I love about it is it's an alphabet book for adults. So it arranges all of the information, all the recipes according to vegetables, and they're in alphabetical order. And so this is a book that you would pick up and use if you, for example, had gone to the farmer's market and it was spring and asparagus was, there for you to purchase. And she gives you some information on what to look for when you go to purchase this food. What does it look like when it's fresh? Because many of us don't grow our own food. And here are some other types of recipes that you might use or might find in the book. One of the other things that I find really interesting here is that she assumes that you have a familiarity with cooking, because you don't see lots of definitions of what she means by particular terms, like braising and broiling and those kinds of terms that you would use in cooking. The other thing that's interesting is that some of those recipes are they're shared with you in the way that your mother would share or father might share recipes with you, where they tell you about a handful of this or a sprinkle of that. And it assumes that you have some sense of what cooking is like. And so this is the kind of book that is designed for someone who has a lot of understanding about this topic of cooking. So these books exist on a text complexity continuum, from books for beginners to books that are more complex for those who have more understanding about the topic. So when you see this in children's books, one of the things that you'll notice is that we do things to help teachers, like put levels on them. So while you would not see that on a book like the Betty Crocker cookbook or Alice Waters books, you will see this for books that end up in the classroom. So one of the things that I was doing once was a presentation for principals, and we were talking a lot about the different kinds of books that exist in the intermediate grades. And so I was talking a lot about, different types of books that you might see in classrooms. And one of the examples that I had on hand was The Giver. And I thought, I wonder what the levels are if you look at The Giver. And so I just Googled The Giver and levels. And this was the information that came up for me. The Giver, if you don't know The Giver, The Giver is a book that's typically thought of as a book for early teenagers and middle schoolers, young adults. It's a dystopian novel, and it's one of those books that you wouldn't expect if you see the grade level here. It's not a book that you would expect children who were reading at around the 5th, even at the end of 5th grade going into 6th grade, would be picking up The Giver and using that book. It's typically 7th or 8th grade before teachers are using that with the students in their classroom. And so then there was a Lexile level, a DRA level given, and then a Fountas and Pinnell level, F&P, which is usually thought of as a guided reading level. So one of the things that was interesting to me was that there were lots of discrepancies among the levels that are given for this book. Well, then I pulled out another book called The Summer My Father Was 10, and I thought, I wonder what kind of information I would get with this book. Now, if you don't know this book, it's a picture book. It's typically used with students in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. It's about a young boy who's, has a really difficult experience when he's 10 years old, and it's told through the lens of his child, because the father has grown up and had his own child, and they end up planting a garden, and part of that conversation is about an event that happened the summer the father was 10. So here's the information that's given on this book. When I just Googled the summer my father was 10 levels. And interestingly enough, it is the same grade level as the giver. The Lexile level, however, is considered to be much more complex than the giver. The DRA level is showing as 4th grade, and the Fountas and Pinnell level is shown as a Q, which would be considered around 4th grade level. So the questions that this brought up for me was, what does all that leveling information mean? And what might account for the discrepancies? Not only the discrepancies of what you see for a particular book, but also discrepancies, between these two particular texts that are there. And what are implications that might arise when you think about using that text in the classroom? So these were some of the questions that popped up, but we see a lot about levels. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about is levels and text complexity and what we mean. All right, so we'll start with this whole notion of text complexity. So this is a visual that appeared in Common Core, and many states, including California, have taken this visual on into their framework. This is found in Appendix A in Common Core standards, and then it's threaded throughout different frameworks as you look through them. So we're going to think a little bit about what we mean by these different levels. So there's quantitative, qualitative, and reader task. So we're going to talk first about quantitative leveling. All right, so this is a mathematical formula that's used to determine a text complexity. And it uses passages from the books. Those passages are typically lengths of 100 words. And in longer novels, there might be 3 different sets of passages that would come from those books. And that information, that passage is fed into the mathematical formula. One of the things it's looking at is number of sentences. It looks at number of words within each of those sentences and the number of syllables in those words, all within that passage of 100 words. Then there's a computer-generated level that gets produced based on the mathematical formula. And there are different mathematical formulas that different programs use. Lexile and grade levels are typically considered quantitative levels. So some of the different mathematical formulas might be the Flesch-Kincaid formula. That one is used heavily. There's Fry's readability. That's another quantitative measure. Lexile is its own quantitative measuring. If you use AR, they have another quantitative system as well. The challenge with all of that is that a teacher cannot determine a quantitative level. You have to have access to that mathematical formula, and you have to have a computer to do the math and do the work on it. I mean, I guess you could, but on a regular day-to-day basis, it's not a tool that a teacher can use. So that's quantitative leveling. And quantitative leveling does not consider qualitative factors when it produces that measure. Qualitative factors are things that are used to look at the degree of the text complexity, and it looks at different qualities. So some of the qualities that get used are, looking at, and it uses a degree and balance of the qualities as well. So it might look at qualities like themes and ideas. So this is, what the text is written about, and is it written in a simple or in a complex way as you look at different ideas and themes? Does it have a main theme or multiple themes that run throughout the book? Content would deal with the topics and the concepts. And those, when you're looking at qualitative measure, would be considered in relation to a reader. So we're going to consider a text level and think, okay, is this a level, or is this a content or a topic that for example, a first grader would know a lot about, or would we expect that an older student would be aware of that content? Genre is another one of these qualitative factors. That's looking at text type and then all the characteristics that are related to that particular genre and text type. Text structure is another qualitative factor, and this is looking at how the text is organized. Typically, in a narrative, it's going to use a chronological ordering, whereas if you're in nonfiction, it might use chronological, but it could also be problem solution or cause and effect. Or it could be a combination of those as well. Then we have sentence complexity, and sentence complexity is going to deal with the syntax of language. And so it can be anywhere from simple and natural to sentences that have embedded clauses and phrases. It could be sentences that use lots of conjunctions, that increases the complexity of the sentence as well. So sentence complexity is something, and again, all of these exist on a degree from more complex or less complex to more complex. Graphics and illustrations is another qualitative factor, and this would be looking at the drawings, the illustrations, the photographs, the graphics that accompany the words. And one of the things that's really interesting when you look at complexity in fiction, as we look at more complex text, typically the graphics and illustrations fade out and are less important. And the opposite is true when you look at nonfiction. As you move up in levels and complexity, you'll notice that there's an increase in the amount of not only the amount of graphics, but also the complexity of the graphics themselves starts to increase as well. Another piece that you would see would be vocabulary, language and literary features, word complexity, and book and print features. So all of these are qualities that you would see. And then you would see Fountas and Pinnell and DRA are both examples of qualitative leveling that you would see text using to describe their complexity. And then one of the things I think that's super important about qualitative measuring is that teachers can determine qualitative levels. If you are aware of the qualities, one of the things that it enables you to do is to look at those features and think about how those look in relation to the text that you're using and the students that you're working with as well. So the other layer that Common Core added to their visual is called reader task. And so when you think about reader task, one of the things when you think about readers is you're considering their background and their purpose for reading. So one of the things I think that this reader layer of complexity also does is it acknowledges that there's a nonlinear development of students' abilities. So we don't think of it, they must have this before they have this. It really looks at that layer of recognizing that students understand things in a nonlinear fashion. And in reader task, it's also looking at the context for the reading. So we're thinking about, who chose the book, because one of the things that's really, challenging sometimes is that sometimes the teacher asks you to read a text and, it may be a more complex text than you feel comfortable with. Whereas if you're choosing a book, it may be something that you're, very, very comfortable with and know a lot about. This also considers children who, develop very strong interests in an area. As a kindergarten teacher, I had kids all the time who could name all of and read all of the dinosaur names, but struggled with words like is and at and of, so they're just recognizing that children have a wide variety of what it is that they come and bring to that reading task, and a text that is more complex is going to depend on the reader, just like the cookbooks. If I am a novice cook, that Betty Crocker cookbook is as complex as I need, and the person with more experience and more knowledge base would be able to tackle something that has more complexity in the text. So all of that said, what do we mean when we talk about level text? And I think the first thing that you have to hold in your head about level text is that level only matters when you're talking about guided reading. Level is not important when you think about read aloud. It's not important when you think about shared reading, and it's certainly not going to be the way that you organize the independent libraries that children choose the books that they read during independent reading. So level is something that helps us as teachers to know what we're talking about when we look at a book. It helps us to compare books along a continuum. But Texts are leveled, not children. And so what we want to think about is how do we support kids to be able to use the text in different ways. So one of the things I always hold in my head too about leveled text is that there's this idea about leveled text, and then there's the phrasing I use is texts that have been leveled. And so what I mean by that, leveled text would be texts that are designed according to some specific qualitative criteria, and they're controlled for those different elements that we mentioned earlier. They're usually created as part of a leveled text collection. So they exist in relation to other books that are in those same levels, providing lots of opportunities, as well as books across the different books, different levels in the text collection. These books are created specifically for instruction. They're not books that you can go to Amazon and buy, and they're not going to be available individually. And then there's texts that have been leveled. These are books that were created for very different purposes. Books like this, The Giver, is a book that has been leveled. The Summer My Father Was 10 is a text that has been leveled. When you go on and look at levels, those levels came to be after the text was published. So those levels are going to be very, very ish in the way that I think about it, because those texts weren't designed for necessarily being in a guided reading lesson. Doesn't mean that you couldn't use them there, but I think as a teacher, I need to know that just because a level is on a text does not make that text a leveled text. And so it's not going to have the tight criteria that a leveled text that was created as part of a leveled text collection is going to have on it. So you just always hold that in your head as you're looking at them. Now, the reading development chart I put back in here because as we think about leveled text, what we have to realize is that these texts are written and created in such a way to develop and provide opportunities for the development of these reading behaviors that you see here. So the reading behaviors exist along a continuum. The texts are created to support the development of those reading behaviors. So I have created some slides that have different books, for example, some PDFs of different books. And I'm going to talk about them in relation to the reading development chart, because one of the things to know is that the way that text is put together for supports and challenges depends on the reading behaviors that it's trying to develop or trying to provide opportunities to develop. So when I look at early emergent texts, we have level A and level B books within that early emergent reading stage. So when I look at a level A, one of the things I'm going to think about, like with a book called Pets at Home, is one of the level A books in the Flying Start materials. When you look at text in these levels, one of the things that we're trying to do is support the kids to locate where to begin and where to end the reading. So one of the things you'll see in a level A book that is written as part of a leveled set of books is that the print will always appear in a consistent place. You're not going to see it on one page at the top, the next page at the bottom, one page on the left, one page on the right. It's consistently placed in the book, because one of the things we're trying to help kids to understand is where to begin the reading, where to end the reading, how to read the words from left to right in sequence. There will always be a very strong picture-text match. In other words, the one-word change that you find in these sentences, by looking at the photograph or the picture or illustration, the child will be able to bring that knowledge into being able to problem solve that word. So one of the things that's super important here is that kids are understanding that it's important to use the pictures to help you as you problem solve the unknown words. So one of the things I would be looking for during the guided reading lesson is if the kids are pausing on that new word and checking out the photograph or looking at the photograph before they begin to read that sentence. The texts are patterned in these early emergent levels, and patterned very, very specifically, like the sentence itself is repeated on each page in a level A, because we're trying to support the kids to recognize and use a pattern. One of the things that it does is it holds the syntactical structure consistent as they move through the book, because the kids are coping with a lot of other things like understanding to look at the picture and making their fingers match the words as they read. One of the other things in a level A and B as well is that there will be a large space between the words. And that space is really essential because we're supporting kids to understand and learn to differentiate word boundaries and learn to understand that a word has a space or it has letters in it, and then there's a space between that word and the next word. And so in order to see that, we try to put a big space, we put a big space there so that the kids are more aware of that spacing. One of the other things I always notice too is that in a level A book, when children are learning that, you typically see single syllable words. And so cat as opposed to kitten. So kitten's going to have a couple of syllables in it. So you see the word cat coming in there. So all of that is designed to support those reading behaviors that level A is trying to provide opportunities to develop. So one of the last things that Okapi does in their books, which I think is really helpful, children as they're reading the pages can appear as though one-to-one match is very firm. But when you get to this last page, which is a summary and enables the kids to begin to notice all of the animals that were found in this book, sometimes kids will put their finger under the word dog and they will read, my dog is in here, and they will tap the word dog 5 times. And that gives you a sense that maybe one-to-one match is not quite as firm as I had thought. Level B is a little bit more challenging. So there's a little more complexity in a level B. Always know the lower the letter level, the bigger the difference between one letter level and the next. Big difference between A and B, not necessarily between M and N as you move on up in the levels. So early emergent level B is going to have a pattern, but the pattern's usually bigger. It's going to be a couple of different sentence patterns. It could be 2 sentences that repeat. So in this particular book, here is the, and then the animal, the can see the is the pattern, and it repeats on each 2-page spread. So there's more than one word change here. So students have to use the beginning letter to check. So the last reading behavior in the early emergent reading section of the reading development chart says uses known initial letters to figure out words. So for the student, when they come to the page where you see the big, they have to realize that you look at the word rooster and it couldn't be the word pig because R doesn't make the sound that you would hear at the beginning of pig. So what this is beginning to do is support kids to check their understanding and to check their reading to make sure that it all works. You know, they're looking at the picture and it makes sense. They're thinking about the sentence and does it sound right. They're also looking at the beginning letters and matching their fingers to each of the words and making sure that they have enough words or don't have too many words. And then also when their finger is under words like can, that's the word that they're reading. When it's later on under the word the, that's the word that they're reading. And you do see here that rooster, you know, sometimes the kids want to bounce by syllables, so the rooster, and then if they say stir and they move over to can, that because they now own that sight word, because by the time they get to level B, they've usually got a sight word or two like can, it enables them to use something that they can check on their reading with. And so again, supporting them to understand word boundaries, the spacing is still there, and that sort of thing. So all of this enables children to develop those behaviors that are in that early emergent column. So then you move over into the emergent column. These are kids that have a lot of things in place. They have a lot of sight words by this point. They are learning to look through the words. So when they come to a word like, or a book like Little Monkeys Dance, you're going to see that the pictures no longer are directly telling you about the words. So it's not just one word that they have to cope with. By a level D, you don't see pattern so much. You might see a pattern in events, but you don't see language patterns consistently throughout the book. Those have faded away. But the children still have lots of information to support a conversation about the storylines before they begin to read the text that's here. So we still do that book walk where we have a conversation about the illustrations so that the kids can bring that information, that meaning, to help them as they are decoding and working to make sense. One of the things that our students are going to be working towards is making sure that they're noticing when their reading doesn't match. And so again, the students are having to really attend to the print that's there on the page. But they have to look through the words. So little monkey jumped doesn't come from just looking at the picture, it comes from looking at the text, but also noticing those endings. So you're going to see a lot of root words, which is something you see listed in the early column, but it's something that begins appearing in some of those later level D texts as well. So they start looking through and noticing. You move on up into early, and one of the things that we begin to see here, for example, in like the book Bat Rescue, is that up until about level F, one of the things that you would see is that most of the time when a new sentence begins, the print comes back to the left and begins. But what you start to see here is that the sentences continue. And so sometimes nets are put over plants and trees. This stops is on the same line so that the students continue to read, but they attend to punctuation. They pause, and they think about this for meaning. So they're learning to read with fluency and phrasing as they attend to simple punctuation. One of the things that has been appearing all the way through in these books is that they're getting actual storylines. At around level D, the true storyline has appeared. And because there's not necessarily in level D and on a repetitive pattern for sentence structure, sometimes kids get stuck at level D when the language becomes too much to cope with. So one of the things we would see as they get on up into F is that you're not going to see pattern when you're in these early books. So this requires that kids are really making sense of the text, and that they're also being able to cope with some of these longer sentences and so forth. In the next stage up, in the transitional stage, one of the things that we're starting to notice here is whether or not kids are integrating meaning, structure, and visual. So they're really learning to look at text, think about what makes sense. Does it sound right? Does it look right? And they're going to see words that they have to look for chunks in the words. They have to look for patterns in words, like the word hungry, to figure out what would make sense there. They're coping with a wider variety of punctuation, looking like at the quotation marks and that sort of thing, exclamation marks and that sort of thing. One of the things, though, that's still in place to support phrasing is that phrases are kept together on a line. And so what you'll see here is that, for example, on page 9 here, when it says he sat very still and waited, there was space to put the word and on that, on the same line as he sat very still and waited. But and waited is a phrase, and so that is kept together on the line. The same thing when you see where on page 8 it says make a web and trap something. There was space to add the word to on that line, but to eat is a phrase, and so that's kept together to support that phrasing, which supports meaning to be made. Many of the things that start to happen in these books as well is there's an expectation that children are able to discuss the relationships between characters, and so you begin to see that kind of storyline happening all the way through as well. Up in early fluent, at this point we're beginning to see, this would be considered the end of first grade, this level I and J early fluent. This is when you begin to ask kids to really consider how character setting and plot work together. So in a book like Gasari's Herd, we're introduced to a particular character. This book has a very strong introduction. And you'll notice it's beginning to use multisyllabic words like adventurous, and fearless. And we're asking kids to be able to take on more vocabulary within this text as well. And one of the things, though, you'll see is that these are the kinds of words that children are going to usually have run across in their listening vocabulary if they've had a teacher who's doing a lot of good read aloud. But it requires, when they're reading this, for them to be able to look at patterns in words and look at chunks in words and know what to do. And so it supports us as teachers to provide opportunities and support if that's something that's a challenge for kids. You know, when they're running across a word like adventurous, you know, what do they do when they come to words that are big like this, and do they stop? Do they begin to try and sound everything out? And we can support them to learn to look at multisyllabic words for patterns. Again, one of the things that we see here is that in these levels, we no longer necessarily see chunks kept together. So there are breaks in the phrasings. And so what we want is for kids to be able to recognize that you wouldn't insert a period into your voice. So when they read, this elephant was adventurous and brave, and she was much loved by the rest of her herd, that they're not inserting punctuation into their voice. They're recognizing that after the word by, some other words would come. And so that reading and that smoothness and that phrasing is therefore sustaining meaning. In this particular book, one of the things that really begins to happen is that they're learning about how characters are introduced into text. So at the beginning, we begin to learn a lot about Gasari, who's adventurous and likes to go on these walks. But then one day, when she's on a long walk, when she comes back, she sees her herd being taken away. And we begin to, at that point, to really begin to see how children are able to consider character and character dynamics and how that drives the events in the story. So the setting, the character in the setting, you know, driving the events in the story. So that connection between plot, character, and setting in fiction is really powerful. We move into early fluent in nonfiction as well. And you start to see that nonfiction becomes really strong chapters, but we also want kids to learn to use chapter headings to anticipate text content, to begin to prepare them for reading those chapters and being able to think about all the kinds of ideas. A lot of these texts are removed from kids' everyday life experience, and so they're beginning to learn about things that they won't have direct experience for. In the fluent category, again, it continues to extend that learning about the world as they are reading through. We ask kids in these levels to begin considering genre and text types as they anticipate and organize their thinking. So learning to use features such as tables of contents and indexes to help them begin to think about what they might be learning about in that text. One of the things that also begins to occur is that kids are having to bring information, you know, really, really heavily from one part of a text to another to understand. And so they see that variety of text features, but they have to do a lot of thinking between the text features, a lot of thinking between the text features and the running text, but also text features from one section of the text to another as they begin to make sense out of all the big ideas that are shared within a particular text. One of the things too, many times kids are reading text from nonfiction to fiction. In Okapi's materials, they pair nonfiction and fiction text. And so they're able to bring a lot of content knowledge over into a fiction text and use that information to help them to anticipate storylines and anticipate what might make sense as they're reading that text. In the fluent levels as well, they're starting to read longer chapter books. So one of the things that you see here in these are those second grade ish levels, is that they're starting to read chapter books that are more of an extended length, and they're having to make sense of those kinds of texts as they're reading. They'll also see that many times we're having to figure out what characters are thinking and feeling just from what they say. So they have to use the context, so the setting, to help them to figure out what might be going on, and as they're trying to figure out what's happening with characters. In the Fluent Plus books, we start to see, again, to be able to think about that genre and that text type, but also they'll see an increase in the complexity of the text. They'll see a lot more text features that they have to interpret, as well as integrate with the running text that they're running into. There's a lot more vocabulary that is defined within the text, within the running words. And so one of the things that this does is it allows for the kids to to do a lot of rereading. which really connects to that notion of adjusting for text type, because in the Fluent and Fluent Plus books, one of the things that we want is for kids to understand that you're supposed to be adjusting the way that you read a text based on the text. And so helping kids understand that, you may need to linger on text, you may need to reread, you may need to pause, look at photographs, come back to the running text, doing this kind of skimming across the text at the beginning to get a sense of the bigger ideas, using headings to get your brain ready for the information that you're going to be learning in a nonfiction book is really powerful. And so the kinds of things that they start running across in these books is going to prepare them for these more advanced texts like Animals in Danger or Orangutans. This is the kind of book that really brings bigger concepts that kids are reading about in the world, but they're also really beginning to evaluate and discuss how authors use different literary devices, different organizational structures, different ways of advancing their points of view. And one of the big concepts that advanced fluent readers are going to be thinking about is that all authors have a point of view as they write, and one of our roles is figuring out what those writers are trying to communicate. Are there biases? Are there different ways that they've written? What language have they used? And be able to synthesize and discuss that information as they make sense of these really sophisticated texts. One of the other things I think a lot about when I'm working with kids, especially in these higher texts, is really helping them to understand how this text expects that they're bringing in their own personal opinions as well. That I'm not reading it to find the facts, I'm reading it to say, what does this author think? Listening for discussions that I'm going to be engaging in with my classmates, and then also coming to that critical understanding of what it is that you think once you've experienced this text. And quite often you're reading multiple texts on particular topics as you go along. So how do we use all that information? When you think about levels in this way, how do you match books to readers for guided reading? So as you think of, first and foremost, we match books to readers, not readers to books. And this is a really big concept when you think about guided reading. Fountas and Pinnell even titled one of their books, Matching Books to Readers. And so when we think about this, what does that mean? So if you think about the process of matching readers and text, this is not something that hasn't happened before. Even before guided reading, we thought about this. But when you think about, for example, in a Basel program, they approach it as matching readers to books. And here's the process that typically happens. I'm sure this is familiar to many people. One of the things that they'll ask you to do is the texts that are created and included in a program would use the focus and the objectives would be identified based on the current unit that you're working in. There would be a pre-test of students to determine if they know or don't know what is to be learned. And at that point, the teacher would, using that pre-test information, would be able to place children in the most appropriate book that's provided by the publisher in that particular week or unit. And typically, there are 3 to 4 different levels that are included. There would be an on grade level, above grade level, below grade level, and in many cases now the English learner version. And so that's matching readers to books. In guided reading, we go about this very differently. The first thing that we do, especially if you were with me in our second webinar, is that we use multiple assessments to determine what students know and do already as they process text. And we're looking at how they process. We're not looking at particular skills. We're looking at the way that a reader would apply skills, what the comprehension understandings are, all of that kind of information through these multiple assessments that we use. We're going to consider students in relation to a continuum of development, of reading development, but we're also going to be acknowledging that there's a nonlinear development to every student's abilities. We can have a continuum here, but kids, always chuckle and say they never quite know what column they're supposed to be in on this reading development chart, but we don't expect them to. And we determine the next needs for multiple areas of processing based on what's already in place. We're not looking and saying, oh, they need just this one skill and I'm going to have a small group that's going to teach that skill. We're going to be looking at how kids are processing and integrating all of the kinds of information as a reader using all of that work. And it's built on what's already in place. Our texts are going to provide opportunities to use what children already know, what's already firm in their understanding, and provide opportunities for them to approximate on what it is that's being applied. But what we also always have to do is look beyond the level. The level gets you into, the right sort of area when you look at a continuum of books, but it's not going to tell you which book to look to that will be the perfect match for that reader. You've got to look at your data and you've got to ask yourself some questions. And the first one I always think about is this going to be a book that's going to interest the students? Is it going to have something that's going to captivate them, something that's going to engage them? Because we want really interesting books in front of kids. We're going to think about what big ideas are represented. Do we have something to have good conversation around? Because in our first session, we talked so much about, our first webinar, that guided reading is really a powerful opportunity for having conversations about text. We then want to think about what's the variety of support that's provided. We want to have a lot of support for kids. The guided reading level that we choose, the text that we choose, should not be a hard text. It shouldn't be something that kids are struggling through. It should feel comfortable when kids are reading it. They should be making sense out of the text. And it should offer some opportunities for learning. So it's not so easy that they don't have to work on anything, but we don't want it to be so challenging that the reader is not able to make sense out of that text. And if meaning breaks down, then how am I going to support that within the context? But what I'm hoping is that the kids are going to be making much of the meaning that's possible within that text. So let me show you some examples. That's what I'm going to do, is take you through a few examples of some kids that and talk about matching books to them. So I introduced you to Caleb in the last session when we looked at his assessment, and we talked a little bit about Caleb's group here with these 5 students. They were together. What were things that they were firm on or approximating on? These were the reading behaviors and things that they would be working on during that guided reading lesson. So again, these were kids who were early emergent, and it was the beginning of kindergarten or near beginning of kindergarten. And so what I chose for them were books like Pets at Home. So I wanted a book that had one line of text. I wanted books that had lots of picture support. I wanted books that used a pattern all the way through with lots of space between the lines of text. And I wanted that last page because that's going to give me a chance, again, to check in and see whether or not they really are understanding that one-to-one match as they get to that last page, which is a nice summary of all the different animals that are found in the book. So this worked for us really well. And after my meetings with the kids over the 3 weeks, I shared this in our assessment. They began to divide into 3 different groups, and they had different needs. So one of the things, I'm going to talk a little bit about Gabriel's and Genevieve's group. I would probably add in about 4 more kids with them if they're kids that are working in this stage. And so some of the reading behaviors that these kids have in place and are approximating or are approximating on. Their one-to-one match, these 2 students, their one-to-one match is very precise. And return sweep was established because they were noticing things on other parts of the book and showing me different things. So return sweep was firm for them. These 2 kids were very consistent as well about noticing the initial letters. So they were already starting to do some checking. And they even began looking through the words in some places. And I noticed that they were beginning to reread, and they were rereading sometimes to think about making sense, sound right, and look right, but weren't necessarily always consistently doing that. And so what I thought about for them was I would look for level B and C text. So I would want 2 to 4 lines because they already have return sweep established, and 2 to 4 lines of text on a page is going to give us some meat to hang on to as we're having conversation. The B's and C's are going to have less direct picture text match. So I might choose a book like Looking at You. And here the reader, again, has to do some checking because the rooster can see the pig. We have a photograph of a pig, but we don't have a photograph of a rooster on that page. It's on the opposite page, on the other side. But it gives us multiple sentences as well, multiple sentence structures across the book. And it does have pattern, but the patterns are longer, which is some that I want, or patterns are larger, I'm sorry. So it has a two-page pattern that spreads throughout the book. And there's multiple words on each page to problem solve. So they have to look through the words and really stop and attend to the print. Another book that's of a level C that might be appropriate for this group as well is a book called My Horse. And in this one, it has some picture support, but you don't get the text just from looking at the picture. But it also has a variety of continuation. So my horse can is consistent through the book, but the rest of the sentence changes. It uses phrases. The sentences are a little bit longer. It's got multiple words on each page to solve. So I think these would be some of the kinds of texts that I could choose for Gabriel and Genevieve and the other students that we add into this group as they move from that early emergent to emergent reading stage. You met these early readers in our first session as well, and this group of girls, I noticed that they had a lot of things in place. They use pictures to predict and confirm, but they seem to process illustrations and words separately. Some of the things that I wanted them to do were here. So what I began to think about was, what are some of the reading behaviors that I want to firm up for them to make more consistent? One was using the text and the illustration and integrating those together, being able to discuss different aspects of the story as we're going in, thinking about characters' actions and feelings. They're doing this in some places, but not necessarily always, and that discussing relationships between the characters. So I might look for stories that have storylines with multiple characters, obviously, and some supportive illustrations that carry and add to the storyline. So I might choose a book like Little Monkey's Dance that we saw a few minutes ago, because that's going to give us an opportunity to help them to begin to check what they see in the text and what they see in the illustrations. I'd like for these books that I share with them now to have some familiar high frequency words, but I'd also like, again, the sentences to get a little bit longer, so it gives them a little bit more work to do. And then offering them a few 2 and 3 syllable words to problem solve, I think, would be helpful as well. So each of these books has some opportunities for that. So these D and E books, I think, would be really appropriate to put with these readers. We also met in our last session, this group from grade 5, Giovanni, Elizabeth, Princess, and Marilyn, and I shared the story about how the teacher talked about these kids and realized that they actually were 2 different groups of kids, and so began to say Giovanni, Elizabeth, James, and Luis were going to be a group that worked together, who were reading across several different levels of text here. But they had some of the same things that the teacher was supporting, some of the same behaviors, but also that were firm, but also some of the ones that she wanted to work on. And so when I began to think about text for this group, because their fluency rates varied, one of the things that I might want to do is make sure that the book has short chapters, so that when I ask the kids to read in guided reading, that they're not, if there's a long amount of text that they have to read in that moment, those fluency rates will start to show. So I can use shorter chapters to help them to be able to finish closer together at the same time. We would definitely want them, as the teacher said, she wanted them using multiple points of evidence. So one of the things that I'm going to make sure is that there's a lot of opportunity for kids to have to integrate graphics and running text, but also having to do that across the text as well. Having a real variety of text features and graphics for the kids to have to use as they are coming into this text, because they use text features, but we want to increase that variety and give them the opportunity to work between the text and graphics, the running text. And then also offering them some challenges in vocabulary, so that I can help them to see different ways that they can figure out definitions, not only using graphics like a glossary, but also learning to look for definitions within a text. Wildfires is a book that does that really well. It's a book that, for example, it defines words. For example, this is called arson on page 6 at the bottom. This is called arson and it's against the law. That phrasing, this is called, is one of those phrases that introduces a vocabulary word. And we look for the sentences before to help us figure out what this is referring to. On page 7, it begins with this: the material that burns in a fire is called. And so that is called phrase can help them to think about as another way that authors are giving definitions, but then also giving examples throughout the rest of the paragraph is another way that definitions are given within a text. So we want to give kids the opportunity to see examples of that, but also helping them to see a variety of different features here and different ways that they're going to have to tackle the information that's there, but also beginning to integrate that information as well. In nonfiction or in fiction, I would want to, again, to think about if these are some of those reading behaviors that I'm supporting, what are the things I'm going to look for within the text? So if I'm trying to support them to use text features to support meaning, I would look for a book like Hard Choice because those chapter headings support the kids to get a little sense of the storyline as it goes across, as they go and read throughout the text. And they're going to really have to use the illustrations to give them some support, because this one still has this, because these are lengthier, they have a lot more multisyllabic words, the characters change over time, and the setting and the events impact the character decisions. So one of the things that you'll notice as you move through text is that we offer a balancing of support. If there is a challenge in one particular area, for example, the content is very challenging, what you might find is another area, another qualitative factor that will be used to support that. So if the vocabulary is very challenging and concepts are very challenging, we might have a lot of picture support to support that vocabulary. We might also have shorter sentences so that sentence complexity is not there, as well as idea complexity. So there's a balancing of those supports and challenges that occur. But when you select a text, you keep Margaret Mooney's advice in mind. At all times, the teacher's decision-making is driven by what children need for their learning rather than what children need to learn. And I just always think about that being one of the most important concepts when we think about matching books to our readers. So questions that you might have as we're thinking about this. One of the questions that someone shared, let me take a peek at this question that they were putting up here. One is about where you use levels and should the books in your library be leveled. So one of the things to think about is that level really matters when you're working with guided reading. You know, that's one of the places, because guided reading levels help us to choose a book that we know a reader is most likely to be successful with, but still offer some opportunities for you know, really firming up some things that kids are approximating on. But levels, they're not important when you're thinking about books for read aloud. They're not important for books when you are thinking about shared reading. And they're most definitely not the way you want to organize the books in your classroom libraries for kids to select from. One of the biggest challenges is sometimes libraries are leveled and you have that kid who really wants to read, you know, say the dinosaur book, and it's over in a level P, but, you know, we tell them that they can only read levels in, you know, say a level F. And what that does is it begins to define the reader as a level, not the text as a level. And that's one of the things that you always hold in your mind about levels, is that levels are about book complexity, text complexity. They're not about readers complexity, because kids can read lots of books depending on the background that they bring to that text. The more you know about something, the more complex text that you will be able to tackle. Okay. So if there are any other questions, I'm going to count in my head to about 10, and that gives anybody who's still got a question that they want to share a question. Okay, so if there aren't any questions, so our next webinar will be for teachers of children who read in that emergent stage K-1, and that will be on March 16th. So I hope that you're able to join me for that, and have a really great rest of your day and week, or 2 weeks, I guess, until this next one. And thank you so much for joining me.